Ghost in the New York City by A Shark's Reading Glasses on AO3. Chapter 7. Haley's Comet. Peter sat hunched on the sofa in his apartment, his elbows on his knees as his hands were folded in front of his face, while he bit on the nail on his thumb as he tried to process the information Wade had given him. Wade was leaning against the brick wall by the window that led to a tiny porch attached to his apartment, flipping a spare switchblade aggressively between his fingers in one hand, while the other was stuffed in his leather jacket pocket. Even with the Deadpool mask rolled up past his mouth, Peter could recognize that Wade was pissed when his spider senses made the hair on his arms stand up. Usually, when Wade was this angry, he'd head over to Hell House for a job that took days of radio silence. "What's our move, Pete?" Wade asked tightly, his usual goofy and playful cheering stripped from his voice like old paint. The small prickle of his spidey senses told Peter that Fido was hanging around somewhere. Peter winced. When he tried to look for meta-human discrimination or protection laws, there were woefully very little. Not that it mattered, now that Danny had confirmed definitely he wasn't a mutant. He still tried looking up laws for ghosts and ecto entities to cover his bases, but they've gotten almost too much information on the opposite end of the spectrum. Most of the laws concerning ghosts were containment and experiment protocols. There were few on proper conductions for official penetations on the search and seizures of personal property, but none on the general protections of ghosts, which had sent a spike of fear down Peter's spine. Without any sort of protections for ghosts at all, Danny could easily slip through the cracks if they weren't careful. It just got a bit more complicated, legal-wise, Peter answered, continuing to bite at his nail. "I might need to call in a favor." Wade huffed and turned his head after giving the switchblade a final twirl before closing it dexterously, slipping it back to his pocket. "We gonna call in Hornhead?" Wade asked as he crossed his arms. Peter flicked his eyes to Wade, lowering his hands. "Are you asking if we're gonna call Matt? Or are you asking if we're gonna call Daredevil?" Peter replied, leaning back into the couch and drumming his fingers on his arms. Wade answered, smile was like teeth, like they had devils for his own. Knowing Wade, he probably did. Peter rolled his eyes in exasperation before he refocused and chewed his lip. "Let me try talking to Danny about his parents tomorrow before we bring Matt in. I'm gonna see if I could spend the day with him anyways." Wade huffed again before pushing himself off the wall, reaching back to pull the hood from his jacket, leaning in his head and dragging his mask over his mouth. "Fine," Wade growled as he stomped to the door. "Whatever. If you need me, I'll be at Hell House." "Wade," Peter said sternly as he stood from the sofa, and Wade paused in front of the door, his head turned to listen. "We have to be careful, all right? One wrong move, and Danny will get lost in the fine print." Wade sighed and rolled his shoulders, slipping his hands into his pocket. "Relax, Petey Pie," Wade tousled easily over his shoulders. "There are still some assholes out there who think it's okay to leave kids to die in a dumpster. I'm just heading over there to see if Weasel got any info. I'll text you later." Peter sighed as Wade left the apartment, laying across the sofa and throwing an arm over his eyes. He didn't have time to try and reason with Wade right now. He had another favor to cash in. He hoped for the muggers' sake that they were already caught or laying low somewhere if Wade got any info on them. To DP 2.0. "Hey, Danny, Wade told me about today. You doing okay?" DP 2.0 is typing. DP 2.0 is typing. "Your message has been read." To DP 2.0. "Yeah, I figured. You don't have to talk to me about it if you don't want to. Hey, I've got an idea. How about you and me hang out tomorrow? I found this awesome museum I wanted to show you." No spiderweb emoji. Spider emoji. Spiderweb emoji. No ghost emoji. No troubles. Just you and me. DP 2.0 is typing. From DP 2.0. Okay, when and where do you want to meet? To DP 2.0. I'll meet you at the safe house at 8:30. Is that good for you? From DP 2.0. That's fine. See you then. Peter waited outside the apartment building of the safe house, leaning against the stairs that led to the lobby door. He was wearing more comfortable clothes than last time he saw Danny. A red long-sleeve shirt under a blue vest, some thread jeans, and a well-worn-out pair of sneakers. He parted one of his pockets with the vest to make sure his envelopes with tickets were still there, keeping the other in his pocket as he played with a ball of webbing, twirling around his fingers. As much as he hated to admit it, Wade was right when he said that Peter had spider-like tendencies, but doing them just made some corner in his brain happy and satisfied. It's actually kind of nice that Wade noticed, though, Peter thought, as his chest warmed. Peter knew Wade wasn't making fun of him when he mentioned it to Danny. He was just trying to make them both comfortable with their little habits. He continued to twist the webbing around his fingers, rolling it into a ball before unwinding it again. Then he felt a shiver of his spider senses as Danny approached. He straightened up and looked around, doing a double take when he finally spotted him. Danny looked absolutely miserable. He was hunched over in the same dark zipped-up hoodie he wore the night he fought Plasm, hands stuffed in his pockets of a pair of dark blue jeans. What in the hell happened between our text last night and now? Peter wondered, keeping the ball of his webbing in his pocket as he raised his hand to get Danny's attention. Danny blinked and waved back as he made his way over to Peter. "Danny, are you all right?" Peter asked worriedly. "If you didn't feel like coming, you could have texted me or something." Danny shoot his head up, reaching his hands to play with the strings of his hoodie. Can we not talk about it, please?" Danny begged instead. "Okay," Peter quickly resulted, lifting his hands plangently. "I did promise trouble-free day, right? Here." Peter reached back inside his vest pocket and handed Danny an envelope. Danny took it questioningly, opening the flap and looking inside. Instantly, his eyes widened, and he straight up in shock, his mouth gasping like a fish. Peter smiled back at him. "No way," Danny said disbelievingly, and Peter shrugged. "Yes way," Peter replied, giving himself a pat on the back for picking something that could distract Danny for a little while. Already, he could see that Danny was in better, spirits. These are VIP behind-the-scene passes for Hardin's planetarium at the Museum of Natural History, Danny responded, as if Peter had accidentally given him $100 or the keys to the city. "Yep," Peter replied, a little smugly, popping the P. Turning to walk to the nearest metro station. "You coming or what?" There was a beat, and then Peter slumped as Danny grabbed his arms and started pulling him along enthusiastically, even though he didn't know where he was going. "Hell yes!" Danny yelled, smiling wide and eyes nearly glowing lime green in excitement. "Come on, Pete, let's go!" Did you know that the author of 2001 Space Olympics was accurately presented of satellites, space stations, space hurdles, and computer AIs? None of that stuff was even conceived when Kohler wrote in the 1950s, Danny explained, as he walked beside Peter, his arms gesturing enthusiastically in front of him. The cinematic and lighting were so good that a lot of people who think the moon landing are fake think that Claire filmed them. "Space Odyssey isn't too bad," Peter replied as he smiled fondly, being mindful of the others on the sidewalk and guiding Danny around them as they walked the rest of the way to the planetarium. This was the most animated Peter had ever seen Danny, and it was endearingly cute as he stuttered over words in excitement or stumbled slightly when he wasn't paying enough attention. Was that how Peter sounded when he was talking about engineering? I thought the concepts of Warmouth were cool. The idea of math as a universe language was interesting. The ending was really weird, though. Clerk had another really insane idea, and a lot of sci-fi authors borrowed a space elevator, Danny said, skipping ahead and turning around to walk backwards at an amplifier section of the sidewalk. Yeah, it is cool, Peter agreed, using one hand to turn Danny back around and tucking him to the side with his other hand in his pocket, playing with his tiny wooded webbing. Conceptually, it's not yet possible because they need a material with a higher tensity strength. Carbon Knox tubes made with duck balls covered with superconductives is the closest science can get right now. But even if they are still trying to figure out the different philosophies at each end of the elevator, another issue is weight of the material itself. Even one atom thin strand of carbon would weigh over 1 billion tons. I read an article that they're trying to investigate spider silk into the design, Danny replied, eyeing Peter mischievously. Yeah, I read that article too, Peter grinned, taking his arm off Danny's shoulders and ruffling his hair. Proportionally, spider silk is stronger than steel. It's where I got the idea for my web shooters. You made those yourself? Do they actually shoot spider webs? Danny asked in a whisper, eyes big and wide in awe. Yeah, Peter whispered back, grinning playfully. I made them myself, but the webs are synthetic. Danny shook his head in disbelief, and they were both quiet for a moment. Man, Danny said, slipping his hands back inside his hood pockets. How did you even get these tickets? I have a friend who works at the planetarium, Peter replied. We met in my college physics class, but took different career paths after that. I did engineering, and she went into astrophysics. Duh, Peter answered smugly, slipping out from under Peter's arms and racing ahead. That's because astrophysics is way better. Danny, Peter yelled, good-naturedly. They made it to the planetarium and continued to talk, or rather, Danny continued to talk, about space, while they waited in line in the lobby. Peter showed them their pass at the reception at the desk, and they made it to the front with an enormous solar system display looming above them. 2 behind-the-scene passes, the receptionist said, clicking over the tickets. All right, could you give me 1 minute, please, while I get you your tour guide? Could I ask for Ashley Verada? Peter asked the receptionist, handing over his ID. And tell her it's Peter Parker. We spoke earlier this week. The receptionist took the card and double-checked it before handing it to Peter. Let me ask for her, he said, standing up and going to the other door, leading back. They waited for a few minutes, Danny bouncing on the balls of his feet, more than ready to go in. The receptionist came back a few minutes later, reaching over the desk to hand Peter 2 clip-on badges that read, Hardium's Planetarium BTS Guest. She'll be right out with you, sir. Could you please wait here for a moment? Thank you, Peter smiled, taking the badges and handing one of them to Danny. They only waited a minute before Ashley was coming out of the exhibit exit, slipping behind the reception desk to cut to the side they were waiting at, her brown hair swinging in her ponytail. She was wearing a pair of Callahan pants with dark blue collared t-shirt that had Harlem's Planetarium stitched in white on her left shoulder. Peter! Ashley greeted, dragging him for a brief hug and then returning them both back. It's so good to see you. Who's this? It's good to see you, Ashley, Peter answered, before beckoning Danny to stand beside him. This is Danny. I'm watching him as a family of a friend. Hi, Danny said, shyly, and Peter could tell Ashley was instantly endearing to him. Hi, Danny, Ashley said. Hope you haven't been too bored hanging around Peter. Peter sputtered disbelievingly, while Danny smirked. He's been all right, Danny replied, shrugging his shoulders. But this is definitely going to be the highlight of my week. Peter let out a mocking gasp as he grabbed Danny by the shoulders, reeling him in to rub knuckles on his head. Oh, you're such a little brat, Peter said jokingly, before letting go, and Danny laughed as he fixed his hair. Ashley just smiled. You're darn right, Danny, she said, as she led them through the main exhibit entrance. Well, let's start this door. Was there anything in the main exhibits you wanted to see before we went behind the scenes? I'm good, Peter replied. He and Ashley turned to look at Danny. Um, I already looked at all the exhibits when I was here earlier this week, Danny stammered, a little shocked by the attention. Could we do the behind the scenes tour first, and then can we go to one of the IMAX movies if there's time? That's a great idea, Ashley said, leading them further into exhibit before coming to a staff-only door. She pushed it open, letting Peter and Danny go in first before letting them deeper into the planetarium. You guys get a free IMAX movie with the VIP passes. The nearest one is playing in the digital universe at 1:30, so you'll have a few hours to explore. How did you like the main exhibits, Danny? They were awesome. He looked ready to go ghost and do flips in the air. My hometown doesn't really have anything this open to the public. We have an observatory that I go to a lot, but it's getting a bit run down. I'm happy you enjoyed it, Ashley replied, as he stopped briefly at the forks in the alleyway. Danny's enthusiasm infectious. The main goal at the Hardham Planetarium is to provide educational outreach to the public about current astrophysics research and discoveries. To do that, the planetarium is partnered with a lot of different industries and laboratories. One of our biggest partnerships is with NASA, so sometimes we get a lot of cool samples or model prototypes to work with. You guys get to work with NASA? Danny asked, awe dripping from his voice. Yup, Ashley replied. A few weeks ago, we had a meteorite exhibit. We're still preparing some of the samples to be sent back. Would you like to see them? Yes, absolutely, Danny enthusiastic, and Ashley guided them to a medium-sized room filled with moving walls and sliding shelves. Ashley used a remote to the door to move some of the walls apart, stopping when she found the right one and slipping between the newly formed aisles, with Danny and Peter right behind her. She stopped midway down, carefully pulling out a sliding shelf as she pulled out a pair of soft, dedicated gloves from her pockets. There were maybe 10 fist-sized meteorites spreading evenly over the shelves. Some looked cooled clumps of metal sagged. A couple looked collected of metal bubbles. Others were gouged with holes and marked pocks. And finally, a few just looked like regular rocks. Ashley carefully lifted one of the regular-looking ones in the case and gently pulled it apart, revealing that in the inside, Danny gasped. Peter had to admit, it was amazing. It looked surprisingly geometric, lines of shiny metal melted together seamlessly. It reminded Peter of circus boards and one of those optical illusions of those Zen coloring books. Pretty cool, right? Ashley asked, and Daddy nodded admiringly. This is one of the more rare samples NASA sent to us. It's called an iron meteorite, and it's made completely out of iron nickel alloy. Most of the meteorites found on Earth are calorites, right? Danny asked, still eyeing the sample in Ashley's hands. They don't nearly have enough metal in them. Ashley blinked in surprise. Yeah, that's right, she replied as she set the sample back on the shelf before grinning. Well, look at you, all studied up. Danny blushed and fidgeted slightly. I wanted to be an astronaut since I was 5, Danny said. I'm mostly interested in astronomy and space exploration, but my mom used to take me out to watch meteor showers when I was little. Aw, Ashley replied, picking up another meteorite from the shelf. That's really sweet. A lot of our volunteers who work here have similar interests and backgrounds. Would you be interested in volunteering? It seems like you would end up right in your alley. Oh, Danny stuttered, digging his hands in his hoodie pockets. I don't live in New York, just visiting, and I'm still a sophomore in high school. Well, something to think about when you graduate, Ashley smiled, holding the new sample so Danny could see. Are there any new exhibits the planetarium is planning? Danny asked, observing the sample in Ashley's hands. It depends on what people want to see, Ashley replied, Every month, we have a guest speaker give a lecture on specific topic requests by visitors, and our interns think of new exhibit ideas all the time. In fact, we have a long term volunteer and intern team working on virtual reality exhibits generated from satellite scans of the planet, Mars rover data, and computer generated solar system models. Danny's jaw dropped. You guys have VR simulations? Danny exclaimed. Peter! Danny yelled from across the room, a wireless VR set sitting on his face as he turned wildly in circles. Peter, you have to try this! Don't worry about it, Danny, Peter laughed, smiling as he leaned against one of the intern's desks. My eyes are too sensitive to look at those screens like that for too long. You can just take my turn, okay? No problem, Danny answered with a smile grin on his face, craning his head back to look at something in the simulation, while the team of interns at another desk chuckled at Danny's response. Ashley had brought Peter and Danny to a large room, this one partially empty except for clusters of 5 desks and taped off areas on the floor surrounded by mounted cameras. She introduced Peter and Danny to the group of 4 interns who were working on the VR exhibit, and Danny quickly endeared himself to them as he excitedly asked about their project, which Mars rover they were blasting their simulation on, if they were planning on doing the same for other planets or moons, if they were going to add zero gravity movements to the solar system models, etc. As they continued to talk, one of the interns even brought up a padded paper to jot down ideas Danny was unknowingly giving them until one of the interns made a suggestion. You want to give it a go? Danny had practically glowed, sipping back to Ashley to make sure he was allowed, and they wouldn't get in trouble. Ashley just grinned and gave Danny a wink. It is their project, she said. They can show it to whoever they want. It didn't take Danny long to get fitted with a VR headset and a pair of motion controllers. One of the interns explained that the program was just a walking simulation at this point, and some of the other aspects hadn't been implemented yet. The rest of the interns tuned in on the cameras and computers. Danny just patiently followed along, going through the carbonation process for the motion cameras, and he was off on his own little Mars X mission. 2 of the interns stayed by the computers, watching the program run and keeping a lookout for glitches or bugs, while the other 2 crowded around the edges of the simulation area. One followed Danny around, making sure he didn't get too close to the mounted cameras, and the other went through a checklist as Danny tested each feature they had in the simulation. Well, doesn't he look as happy as a clam? Ashley said from the side, and Peter turned. She was holding 2 paper cups of coffee in her hand, one held up for Peter. Thanks, Ash, Peter said, taking the cup and returning to watch Danny. And he certainly does. This is the happiest I've seen him all week. He really is a sweet kid, Ashley stated, and Peter nodded while he took a sip of his drink. Is he yours? Peter spat his coffee back into his cup as he tried not to choke. Ashley, Peter whispered, down fondly. I told you I'm just watching him for a family friend. What? I'm just checking, Ashley whispered back as she leaned against the same desk as Peter. You just look like a proud dad, that's all. Peter sighed and set the cup on his desk. He's been having troubles with his parents, Peter told her. The last couple of days has been hard for him. I just wanted to cheer him up. Ashley paused, the smile slipping from her face as she chewed her lip. Is he going to be okay? She asked softly. I don't know, Peter admitted, watching Danny closely as he continued to ask questions as he explored through the simulation. But I'm going to do my darnest to make sure he is. Danny spent the rest of the day in total bliss, finally tucking himself out after running around in the simulation for 45 minutes. He spent another 10 with the intern team, giving them his general impression and relaying any glitches he thought he noticed. Ashley gently reminded them that they had more of the tour to continue, and Danny asked for pictures with the intern for a scrapbook before they were off. Ashley guided them through the rest of the inner workings of the planetarium, stopping with a volunteer or interns as they went. Danny gave his full attention to each of them, asking questions about their work and engaging with all the people he met. It was amazing to see Danny break out of his shell, and Peter could see he was starting to gain the same easy confidence he had as Phantom. He was almost reluctant to leave when Ashley mentioned that the iMovie was starting soon. But the older volunteer had stopped to chat with, just smiled and encouraged them to go. It was nearly 3 in the afternoon when the movie finished, and after a quick stop at the gift shop for Danny, they were done. Peter could have smacked himself. Of course Danny wanted a space pun t-shirt, and of course he would immediately put it over his other t-shirt from this morning, the dork. After they had said their goodbyes to Ashley, Peter and Danny headed back to the safe house for a late lunch, as Danny had been snacking on candy for most of the afternoon. During the subway ride to Queens, Peter tried to keep the conversation as lighthearted as possible by asking Danny his favorite things about the tour. Peter knew that at some point he would have to talk to Danny about his parents, but he wanted to see Danny so open and confident for a little longer. When they made it back to the safe house, Peter ordered pizzas, while Danny slumped into the kitchen chair as his energy levels finally wandered. As Danny tiredly kicked off his shoes under the table, Peter bounced his phone from hand to hand after the call with the nearest pizzeria ended. He figured now would be as good time as any to discuss with Danny the topic of his parents. But just as he opened his mouth, Danny spoke. "Hey, Peter?" Danny asked, drowsily, his arms pillowing his head on the table. "Thank you for taking me out to the planetarium to cheer me up. I couldn't have thought of a better way to spend my last day in New York." Peter's heart sulked and his stomach plummeted, nearly dropping his phone if it weren't for his sticky fingers. "What?" Peter questioned frantically, slipping his phone into his vest pocket and quickly walking to the opposite end of the table. Danny blinked and lifted his head slightly. "Oh, I guess I forgot to tell you guys," Danny responded, picking his head up while lying still on the table. "My parents got a little, spooked by our fight with Vlad. They wanted to head home, a couple days early." "When are you leaving?" Peter asked, hesitantly. Danny let his chin rest atop his arms. "Tomorrow morning." He bruised miserably. Peter dragged a hand over his mouth, worriedly. "Shit! I thought I would have more time to ease into things." Danny watched as Peter panicked and tense, sitting up in his chair. "Why? What's going on?" Peter heaved a sigh, pulling out another chair and sitting down. "Danny," Peter stated, cautiously, "there was something I wanted to talk to you about." "Okay," Danny said slowly, picking at his new t-shirt. "What is it?" Peter swallowed and took a breath. "It's about your parents," Peter answered, and Danny instantly tensed, getting defensive, and standing from his chair. "Is this about what Wade told you from yesterday?" Danny demanded, but it came out slightly shaky. "Like I told him, my parents aren't hurting me." "All right," Peter agreed, plainly knowing that outright arguing about it would just put Danny deeper in denial. "They aren't hurting you, but they are hurting Phantom, aren't they?" Danny's mouth closed, and he hunched in on himself, clenching his hands as he slowly sat back down. "Those are accidents," Danny whispered, his hands pressed tightly against his knees. "They wouldn't... If they knew it was me, then they wouldn't..." "Then why haven't you told them, Danny?" Peter implored, speaking gently. Danny's silence told Peter all he needed to know. Peter leaned back against a chair, bringing his hands to wipe his mouth again. "Just let me ask you this, Danny. Do you feel safe at home?" Danny was quiet and still for a moment, before he shook his head no, unable to bring himself to say the words. Peter closed his eyes and took another deep breath before he stood up from his chair. "Okay, let me make a few calls." "No!" Danny shouted, lunging across the table and grabbing Peter's sleeve. "No, Pete, please don't." Danny hiccuped once before he said quietly, "Please, don't." "Danny," Peter repeated, sadly, letting Danny hang onto his sleeve as he made his way around the table to stand by Danny's side. Are you going to try and keep it a secret from them forever? Yes, Danny answered, but then he hesitantly. Maybe. I don't know. What if they find out before you're ready to tell them? Peter asked, seriously. What if they try and kill you? They won't, Danny replied earnestly, tears gathering the corner of his eyes. They won't. They're my parents. They love me. Peter dragged Danny into his arms, hugging him tightly, as Danny shouldered and gasped for breath, tucking Danny into his head under his chin. I think they do love you, Danny, Peter whispered into Danny's hair. But just because they love you doesn't mean they can't hurt you too. Danny shook his head and stayed enfolded in Peter's arms. I want to give them a chance, Danny pleaded determinedly. Please, just give them a chance. Peter pulled Danny back from his arms, and Danny wiped his eyes with hooded sleeves. Damn it. God only knew how Peter wanted more than anything to chalk logic out the window, to tell Danny no, and just squeeze him away from his apartment where he would be safe, but Peter knew he couldn't do that to Danny. Not Danny, who had barely any control of his life. Not who he had friends and a sister that would probably worry about him. Who had hopes and dreams that didn't revolve around being a hero. Who would put himself in danger just so somebody else had the chance to make a right choice. All right, Peter whispered reluctantly. Danny's head jerked up as he looked at Peter, desperately relief shining in his eyes. Really? Danny asked brokenly. You mean that? Yeah, Peter sighed, bringing Danny in for another hug. I may not trust your parents, but I trust you. Danny, I'll leave my faith in that. Thank you, Peter, Danny said, and reached up to dry his face. It was quiet for a moment before Peter brushed Danny back slightly, as his shoulders reached up and ruffled his hair. Here's what we're going to do, Peter instructed, reaching for a slip of paper in the back of his pocket he had with him since this morning. First, you're going to memorize this and keep it in your wallet. Then, after we eat, I'm going to show you how to make a go bag, and you're going to prepare at least 2 of them when you get home. What's this? Danny asked, opening the sheet of paper cautiously. It's my apartment address, Peter answered, and Danny's jaw dropped. If you ever need me, you text me, and if you ever need a place to go and stay, you could stay with me. Danny sniffled again and leaned into Peter's chest. Peter exhaled a small breath and wrapped his arms back around Danny in affection. Thanks, Danny whispers. Just thank you so much, Peter. You'll be okay, Danny, Peter whispers. I've got your back. Danny relaxed as he nodded against Peter's chest. Well, Peter thought as he started to rub Danny's back, now all I have to do is tell Wade. What do you mean, you just let him leave? Wade yelled as he kicked the coffee table in front of Peter's couch. Peter flinched on the sofa as the table slid off the rug and banged into the brick wall. He hoped his neighbors downstairs were out. I didn't have a choice, Wade, Peter grounded out, trying to level a hard head. Wade scoffed, stomping towards the sofa and leaning over him, threatening, getting right up in his face. Bullshit! You didn't have a choice? Wade spat, poking Peter hard in the chest. How could you let him go back to those negligent, closed-minded assholes? What the hell is wrong with you? That had Peter's blood rushing in, like rapid in his veins. He slapped Wade's hand across and slammed him against the bookshelf across the couch, using his super strength, putting an arm across Wade's neck as his spider senses danced along his back and arms. You don't think I hate myself for letting him leave? Peter yelled, and Wade tensed but remained still. That I won't have nightmares about how his parents might kill him? Newsflash, Wade. Of course I fucking do. But what could I have done, huh? Just keep him cooped up in my apartment, a teenager with a life and friends back home? He would have been miserable. Or should I have gone to you, traveling all over the world, looking over his shoulder, running for the rest of his life. Peter heaved for a breath before getting off Wade and walking towards the couch, letting his elbows and his knees hold in his hands in his face. "You should have called Matt," Wade said after a moment, pushing himself from the bookshelf and sitting at the other end of the sofa, crossing his arms. "I wanted to," Peter whispered from behind his hands. "God, Wade, I wanted to, but he asked me to let him try, and I couldn't be another thing in his life he had no control over. I couldn't do that to him, Wade." "So what do we do now? We can't watch him 24/7 like we were practically here," Wade asked softly. Peter blinked and lifted his head out from his hands. "We can't," Peter agreed, relief filling his voice. "But Danny's sister can, and I still have her messages on my phone. We can both text them regularly to make sure they're safe. If he's in trouble, then we could go get him," Wade finished. "Or he could come here," Peter replied, leaning bonelessly into the sofa. "I gave him the address to my apartment. In the meantime, I could start filling Matt in. Hopefully we won't need him, but better that he has a head start on the case, just in case." "Either way," Wade answered, "we'll probably see Danny soon enough." Currently, my program that runs my PNG tuber is a bit lacking. I need to look at my files and see why it's a little corrupted. I can't access it right now, but hopefully I'll access it later. I just want to say, this was an emotional episode, just like yesterday's. Wow. And next one's is also going to be emotional. I think next one, I remember the first time I was reading it. I was reading it in my class, and I started to sob. I started to cry. And we have a guest star next episode, next chapter. Yeah, I got someone to voice act one of the characters for me. And by got to, I mean, I promised them when they found out I could do this podfic that I would let them voice this certain character because, in their words, #babygirl. As always, make sure to eat, sleep, drink water, take your meds, have a wonderful day or night. Join our community Discord server, link is in the description. Subscribe to see more of my content, and thank you so much for watching.